Welcome, everyone. This is Sandy Andrew, your host of the Universal Learning Series radio show, where we discover the spiritual and scientific universe. This edition of the show will feature Dr. Raymond Moody, author of the best-selling book, Glimpses of Eternity. Dr. Raymond Moody's first book was a bestseller, Life After Life. He now reveals new results from his lifelong investigation of what happens when we die. His new book, Glimpses of Eternity. Dr. Raymond Moody's first book revolutionized the way we think about death. Stories of people who died and then returned to life, going through a tunnel, encountering angels, having out-body experiences are hallmarks of what Dr. Moody terms a near-death experience. Thousands of people have contacted Dr. Moody to share their own experiences. The startling pattern that Dr. Moody discovered is at the time of death, loved ones, other people, also have inexplainable experiences. The new book, bestseller Glimpses of Eternity, is the first book to talk about the phenomenon of shared death experiences. Readers will discover deathbed moments when entire families see lights or the room changing shape. Others tell of seeing a film-like review of a loved one's life and learning things that they could never have known otherwise. The stories in the book, Glimpses of Eternity, are a comfort and a mystery, giving us new understanding of the journey that we will all take at the end of our lives. Please visit the website toursoftheafterlife.com. That is toursoftheafterlife.com. And we would like to welcome Dr. Raymond Moody to the Universal Learning Series radio show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on your program.
Our
to
pleasure.
Enable me to talk about my favorite professional subject.
Okay. Well, let's get to it then. Raymond, reading your book, Glimpses of Eternity, which is, for the record, in my humble opinion, absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
I got the sense that you were drawn to the subject of death experience, near-death experience, call it what we want, from a young age. Am I correct in that?
Well, from the perspective of a 66-year-old man, it certainly was a young age. I was 18 at the time, and not being raised religious. My dad was a sort of hardened World War II veteran medic surgeon who served in the Pacific Theater, and although that generation, as you know, didn't talk, I can easily surmise that he must have had some pretty embittering experiences in World War II under those circumstances. And for whatever reason, when he came back, we just weren't religious, which to me was a great blessing, being from Georgia, deep south. That's, I hesitate to think what might happened if I'd gotten into religion, but I just wasn't religious. I was interested in astronomy, and so I just had no notion of an afterlife. But when I went to the University of Virginia at age 18, I decided within literally the first couple of days of my first year that I was going to be a philosophy major, because I got totally hooked on Plato, who to this day is my favorite author. I constantly read and reread Plato, and being immediately impressed with this amazing man who really has sort of hero status in my mind. The fact that he took this question of life after death seriously is what made me wake up to it. I mean, it kind of sounds like a appeal to authority that, I think the question of an afterlife is important because Plato said so, but it was more that his argument sort of convinced me that he was right, that this is the most important question of existence. And at the end of the Republic, he tells this amazing story about this warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield, but as they were preparing the funeral, he sort of sat up and he revived and started talking about this journey he had taken into another world where his life was reviewed and he had all these experiences. And so about a year later, I found another similar account in another ancient Greek books. But at the same time, I thought, well, this is something pertaining to ancient Greece. But in 1965, when I was a third-year student of philosophy, I was then 20 years of age, one of my philosophy professors told me that right there in Charlottesville at the medical school was a professor of psychiatry, Dr. George Ritchie, who had actually been pronounced dead for a period of 9 minutes. And he had this astonishing experience in the interim, and Dr. Ritchie was very open to talking to student groups and so on. So very shortly after that, I went to a meeting where Dr. George Ritchie was talking about his experience, and I was just astonished. I mean, I'd never heard anything like that from a living person, and he was just completely real, this man was. To this day, I can say that George Ritchie was the finest human being I ever knew. And the integrity of this amazing man woke me up immediately to the fact that whatever this is, he certainly accepted it to be true. And so then, again, to make a long story short, I kind of hurried through graduate school, and I got a Ph.D. in philosophy in 1969 at the age of 24. And I began to teach philosophy, and very quickly I found in my philosophy classes that if you just bring up the question of life after death or what happens when you die, students would come up to me, usually after class, and say, Dr. Moody, I had such and such an experience. And so I began to be invited to the civic clubs around town and the various clubs in town, and I began to hear these same stories from the people who were pillars of the community in this little town of Greenville, North Carolina, where I was teaching. Then in 1972, I went to medical school, and that gave me a great opportunity to talk with lots and lots of patients who had almost died. And so it sort of evolved in that way. And I was not the kind of person who was, I think, very apt to study this question. But again, as I said, it was entirely Plato's argument that convinced me that this is the most important question of existence, because as Plato pointed out, everything else sort of turns on this. I mean, if there's an afterlife, then that puts a different complexion on everything in this life.
It's very interesting that you referenced the Greeks. More often than not, conversations around logic, wisdom, philosophy typically start with a reference to the Greeks.
Everything does. It's like this. All of reason came from these few people who lived roughly from 600 BCE to 320 BC with the death of Aristotle, and in that 280-year period, the entire foundations of Western thought were laid down. And a lot of it had to do with these near-death experiences. Strange as it may seem, this was one of the hot topics in ancient Greece, and among these philosophers, Democritus, for example, who was the person who worked out the atomic theory of matter, who was roughly a contemporary of Plato's. And like Plato, he wrote a book on these experiences, near-death experiences and so on. But unfortunately, because